can.
Good afternoon, all. Welcome to our 12th session. Today we are having a topic on palliative care in non-cancerous illness, and it will be taken by Dr. Sunita. So we can start with ma'am's presentation. We can have it for around 40 to 45 minutes, followed by 50 minutes of discussion. We can have a case presentation by 4, followed by its discussion. We can wind up our session by 4:30. Thank you, PHFI team, for being the observer for this session. Over to you, Dr. Sridevi.
Once again, welcome back everyone for our Friday session. As Raju mentioned, sorry. Today we'll be hearing about palliative care in non-cancer illness. Although we have discussed a little bit about this kind of things which happened during the case discussion, but we'll be hearing the scope of palliative care in non-cancer illness. And today we have faculty Dr. Sunita. Dr. Sunita is a medical officer working in General Hospital Ernakulam, and she was working in UK for quite some time, and she's back in Kerala for the last few years now. And she's a very active person in many research activities happening in the palliative care community. And the last one would be her. She and her friends, everyone compiled a module on palliative care during COVID. So that itself shows her experience and expertise in palliative care in non-cancer illness. And she has experience both from UK and grassroots levels in Kerala. So I think she's the best person to deal with this topic. Welcome, Dr. Sunita. Nice to see you again for it.
Thanks, Sridevi. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks Pallium India for another opportunity to take the session. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
I'll just see whether I can screen share. The slides are visible?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
So what I'll be trying to cover in the next 40 to 45 minutes would be to why is it important that I think so far we all know about palliative care in cancer, but why is it important to learn about what's the role of palliative care in non-cancer, and how do we identify such patients? How do we find out which patients in the non-cancer group needs palliative care? And then I'll be mentioning a few words about each of the common non-cancer conditions, including COPD, heart failure, HIV, dementia. I wouldn't have time to go into detail of all the sessions, but the major points which you as a palliative care physician would would like to know about all these non-cancer conditions. So that will be taken in the session. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in chat, and we can answer it either at the end of the session or in between. And also please stop me if you think it's quite fast or if I'm not audible. So we'll begin the session by learning a bit about George, who is 81 years. He's a retired teacher, and he lives with his wife, Susan. He has dementia diagnosed 5 years ago, and he's now deteriorating. It's dependent on all aspects of care from his wife. He's doubly incontinent, and he's also got difficulty in communicating. He's only able to walk about 2 to 3 steps. In the last 1 year, so since the diagnosis in the past 1 year, George has been seen quite a few times by a general physician, neurologist, and cardiologist. So obviously, other than dementia, he's got other comorbidities also. He also had about 3 admissions to the hospital in the last 12 months for pneumonia. And as we all know, when an elderly patient gets admitted for pneumonia, it's likely to be a prolonged stay. And his last admission lasted about 4 weeks. So average, there would be about 3 to 4 or 5 weeks of hospital stay. And this happened 3 times in the last 12 months. After each episode, he did not recover back to the point where he was at before. So he never went back to his baseline level. He was more and more ill as the episodes of admission went on. And the final admission, unfortunately, he died on the ventilator. So I think this is probably a very common scenario which all of us must have, faced in our career. And I would like to pause now, and I would like you to think about a few thoughts about George, and you can mention that in chat. What comes to your mind about his symptoms? What all symptoms he must have had? What do you know about his quality of life? Do you think that George had a good quality of life, at least towards end of life? Do you think his quality of life was good? What about his end of life care? Did we provide a good end of life care, or did he have a good death that we all seem to talk about? And what about the bereavement care? What happened to Susan after that? How did she cope with all these things? So I'd like you all to think about it for some time, maybe in a few seconds, and maybe put some comments in chat, and then we'll have a discussion towards the end. Please feel free to write anything that comes to your mind. I think you've had few sessions on palliative care so far. So do you think George had a good quality of life? Do you think his end of life care was good? Was his symptom well controlled?
Anyone would want to share their thoughts, or you can even type in the chat session or raise your hand so that Raju can see who is raising.
Okay, feel free to type on as the session goes on. I'll just continue with the session. And I'm sure you must be familiar with this definition of palliative care from WHO, where this is the old definition, which is done in 2002, and where we mention palliative care as which is the focus is on patients with life-threatening illness and how we aim to relieve their suffering. This was the old definition of palliative care from WHO. Recently, the International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care has redefined the specialty in 2018, and this has, since a redefinition was suggested, this has been accepted by the whole community as by a consensus. So what we have now referred is the specialty will now cater to patients and caregivers with serious health-related suffering. And they've also given us a list of conditions which will qualify for serious health-related suffering. And you can see that they have a long list of non-cancer conditions in that. So only 2 or 3 are, only 1 or 2 actually is cancer. All the others are the non-cancer conditions, including dementia, hemorrhagic fevers, HIV, malignant neoplasm. So the palliative care, the consensus, the current consensus is that all these patients will have a serious health-related suffering, and they all need input from a special. They all need the principles of palliative care in their management. Now, this map is a map which shows the prediction of how the serious health-related suffering is going to change in the next few years. So they've compared it from 2016 to 2060, and it's the increase in the predicted SHS by World Bank income region. So as you can see, the dark green shows the low income and the low middle income countries, where the prediction is that the serious health-related suffering will increase by up to 155% in the low-income countries and 87% in the low-middle-income countries when we reach 2060. That's how things are going to change. And this chart shows what are the health conditions which drive serious health-related suffering, and again how much it's going to increase. So this is similar to the list that I mentioned a few slides back, but the important thing to remember is the number of deaths per year is going to increase. So you can see that the malignant condition will still top the list when you reach 2060, but you can see that there's an increase in the number of deaths because of CVA, lung disease, and dementia will also rise by 2060. So things are going to change, and we need to give more input into the other non-cancer conditions. Another graph and the figure which shows the distribution of the how the major cause of death worldwide have changed over the past 20 years. So this graph is from 1990 till now, and it shows that the deaths due to communicable disease, initially for years back, we all know that communicable disease was very common. So deaths due to communicable disease is indicated by the red line in the graph. It's gradually coming down, and the blue figure which indicates all the non-communicable diseases significantly rising. And this is a worldwide distribution, and this is in India also the condition is similar. But we can think the important thing to note is that we still have got a huge burden of communicable disease. So our red area is quite large compared to the world graph, but the trend is still similar. So India is also showing a similar trend, but the number of communicable diseases are coming down, but the NCD is catching up alongside. So we have got a double burden of both the communicable and the non-communicable disease. So like the developing countries, all the developing countries, India is now facing an epidemiological transition. So there's a growing burden of NCDs and chronic diseases, and they are currently going to become the leading cause of death in rural India. The estimates say that about 32% of all the death could be because of NCDs, and the peak prevalence of the many NCDs occur at a younger age group. Unfortunately, people tend to get these NCDs at an younger age group than in the developed countries. So that is a pattern that we see in our country, mainly because of changes in the socioeconomic conditions. So what happens is that these people will need care, extended care for a long period of time, and it's a challenge for us because there's an additional burden of communicable disease still there. On top of that, we have got an additional burden to provide support for all these patients with a growing number of NCDs, again, along with the communicable diseases. So the data from the ICMR says that in 2017, regarding the state level of disease burden, shows that about 48 to 75% of the current NCD burden comes from the three important states of Kerala, Goa, and Tamil Nadu. And its highest numbers from Kerala, Goa, and Tamil Nadu, and the number is 40 to 75% is non-communicable diseases. The lowest number is coming from states like Bihar, Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, and Rajasthan. So it actually goes along with the criteria of development. It's like a development in the states that are better developed compared to the Western world, just like the Western world are mirroring all the conditions which is similar to the Western world. Now, so I said it's important to have palliative care earlier, non-cancer condition, but is it same everywhere? So we all know that United Kingdom is supposed to be the place where palliative care is the most developed or highly developed. But this retrospective cohort study was done in a city, major city in UK. It's a study on the community and hospital care palliative care provision from a large UK city. It was published in 2016 from BMJ Open, and it has actually shown that it covered about 4,000 patients. Out of the 4,000 patients included in the analysis, only about 700 had a non-cancer diagnosis. And sadly, the median duration of palliative care input before death for such patients was only 16 days. Well, the current recommendation is that at least 6 months before their death, they should have some input from the palliative care team. So this shows that even in settings where palliative care is well developed, non-cancer patients are still not referred enough. So why do we need to refer patients with non-cancer diagnosis of palliative care? Why is it important? A paper was published in JPSM in 2006 by Solana et al. Have shown that the common symptoms, pain, breathlessness, and fatigue are very common in advanced cancer. So they compared the patients with advanced cancer along with conditions like AIDS, heart disease, COPD, and renal disease. And the findings showed that if you can see that the percentage of various symptoms, so on the first table shows the cancer, and the percentage of various symptoms is common in the non-cancer conditions also when compared to the cancer conditions. So, dyspnea is common in respiratory conditions, COPD, pain, again, the percentage of patients with pain is similar to in cancer, similar to those in HIV. We have got fatigue. It's comparable to patients with heart failure. Depression, the percentage in cancer, again, can be compared to patients with HIV. Anxiety, patients with CKD. Anorexia, patients with COPD. So all the symptoms, all the symptom burden that a typical cancer patient faces towards the end of life, most non-cancer patients will also face. So why do we just give supportive care or symptom management to just the cancer patients? Now, I'll go to individual, non-cancer conditions. So COPD, and the study was published as early in 2000 in Thorax, which compared the quality of life of in end-stage COPD and lung cancer. And it showed that the patients with COPD had a poor quality of life, as well as more breathlessness compared to those with lung cancer. But the unfortunate situation was that none of the patients with COPD received any specialist palliative care input. There was another prospective cohort study of it's called a support study of seriously ill hospitalized patients with COPD and lung cancer, where basically the study was trying to analyze the patient's desire towards end of life. So the same number of patients, the same percentage of patients from COPD and the lung cancer group wanted supportive care and did not want ventilation. So this study was conducted in 2 phases. So the initial phase was trying to find out what this patient's wishes were. And then the next phase was actually what happened subsequently after 1 year. And but what happened was that eventually more patients with COPD actually received ventilation. So obviously researchers, but not the clinicians looking after patients. The clinicians ended up putting the patients on a ventilator, even if they didn't want, COPD patients didn't want to go on a ventilator. So how do we manage? So what all can we do? What are the a typical patient coming with COPD? So what are the management steps? So again, all these treatments would be continued by the treating team. So at different phases of the COPD patients, they need different management. So initially when we start them with short-acting bronchodilators, long-acting anticholinergics, long-acting bronchodilators. That's the first step when you start the management of COPD. And as the disease progresses, they go on to get the second stage when the dyspnea worsens. You can initiate some non-pharmacological treatments like exercise, pursed-led breathing, walking aid, or chest wall vibrations can be added on to the treatment for the COPD. So continuing all the inhalers. And third stage, so we all know it's a progressive disease. Invariably they'll go into the end stage of COPD. So when we reach in the end stage of COPD, we can start medications like short-acting and long-acting opioid. I'm sure management of respiratory symptoms and breathlessness has been covered previously, and you would all understand about the management of breathlessness and the role of morphine and other opioids in that. So this is how the steps of managing patients with COPD, and they should have regular follow-up and reassessment, and always exclude the contributing causes. So coming to heart failure. So next non-cancer condition. Incidence of heart failure in UK is about 1 per 1,000 population per year. And unfortunately, what the studies have shown is that survival rates from heart failure is worse than breast or prostate cancer. So a patient who's got diagnosis of heart failure actually doesn't survive as long as a patient with a diagnosis of breast or prostate cancer, which most of us, or most of the common men wouldn't know, because cancer is always the bad diagnosis, isn't it? But heart failure, you just live with the medications like that. But survival rates are actually poorer than the breast or prostate cancer. And half of the patients who is diagnosed with heart failure die within 5 years of the first hospital admission. So that if a patient has got a heart failure that is very bad enough for him to reach a hospital or has got a hospital admission, then usually what you find is that half of them die within 5 years of the first hospital admission. And between 1/3 and 1/2 the patients die suddenly, irrespective of the heart failure stage. Now, this is the saddest part, because most of them, in spite of any stage they are all prone to have a sudden death. So this potential for sudden death creates a need for discussion of preference of care from the time of initial diagnosis. So that's why it's very, very important for us to get involved, or for anybody to get involved as advanced care planning, because these discussions are very, very important, even from the time of initial diagnosis. So that is why these people can die pretty quickly. Don't wait for the end stage to happen, because patients can, 1/3 to half the patients actually die quite suddenly, irrespective of the heart failure stage. Now, these are some of the medications that the cardiologist would normally start for heart failure patients, and this is based on the New York Heart Association NYHA class and the impact on the key outcomes. So I've put NYHA class 1 to 4, and and with patients with the ejection fraction less than 40%. And these are the medications which actually can impact on the outcome. So you can see that you normally when you use when you reach class 2 to class 4, diuretics are started, and it will decrease the frequency of hospital admissions and increase the functional status. The important thing for us to remember about this is, as we all know, in palliative care, we tend to optimize and rationalize the medications, but we should always remember that heart failure patients, the medications, we can't just stop it, because it is important for them to have a good symptom control also. So all these medications are indicated in all these levels of heart failure. So even in class 4 NYHA, diuretics have a role, ACE inhibitors have a role, beta blockers have a role, mineralocorticoid antagonists have a role, and digoxin has a role. And these will decrease in the hospital admissions, and few of these, the ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, and mineralocortical antagonists actually improves the survival also, and improves the functional status. So it's important for us to also be aware of these medications, and their role at each stage of heart failure. Next one is end-stage kidney disease. Now, the patients with end-stage kidney disease, which one of the group will benefit from palliative care? Now, those who are choose or advised not to start on dialysis, there would be a cohort of patients who would choose not to start on dialysis. It could be various reasons. It could be, everybody, if you start on dialysis, you can't come back, because once you're established in dialysis, when you stop it, there's a higher chance of you die pretty quickly. So, and we all know that dialysis is probably a thrice weekly visit to hospital. So some patients might not want that. Some patients might not be financially, able to provide, or go for dialysis. So those patients who are advised to start dialysis, but they wouldn't start. Now, second group is those patients who are failing to thrive on dialysis, who experience a worsening quality of life and increasing symptom burden despite the dialysis. Then the third group is obviously those who discontinue dialysis. Their prognosis is pretty poor, but and they would need adequate symptom control and end-of-life care at that stage. Other group is those patients who have an extremely poor quality of life, will need frequent hospitalizations and a prognosis that is comparable to common malignancies. So all these patients will have will benefit from an input from the palliative care team. Now the symptoms, as I mentioned in the first slide, which I showed the JPSM article, dyspnea, confusion, pain, anxiety, and depression are very common in the last few days of life, similar to cancer patients. So they need to be addressed. I've got another study again from UK, which is was a landmark study as well as renal failure and palliative care was considered. This was published in 2013. It's a retrospective observational study which compared the survival and the palliative care involvement of two groups of patients who were more than 70 years. One group chose conservative management. The other group chose dialysis and advanced CKD. So how they managed to get this group of patients was that they had a renal and palliative renal clinic, which ran alongside with the renal clinic. And there was a palliative care consultant who was dedicated to do a once weekly clinic with the renal physicians. And there were patients who chose patients could choose, as I mentioned before, there'll be lots of reasons the patients who can opt not for dialysis. So there was a group of patients who just visited the palliative care consultant who went for the conservative route, and the other group of patients who went the dialysis route. And after 1 or 2 years, they did a retrospective analysis of the data. So what they found was patients with who were more than 80 years. The study was done for patients more than 70 years. But when we come to patients who are more than 80 years with a poor performance status or high comorbidity scores, they actually even survived longer when they chose a conservative treatment option as compared to dialysis. So imagine a patient, an 80-year-old gentleman with a diabetes, hypertension, and end-stage renal disease, whose renal functions have deteriorated significantly, and the nephrologists have told that he has to go for dialysis. So that means his kidney functions are that bad. But he decided not to go for dialysis and went for the conservative palliative care route, which is supported by the physician, and it's a multidisciplinary team. So there'll be dietitian involved, there'll be social workers, physiotherapists, everybody involved to look after this patient. And suppose another 80-year-old decide to go in the dialysis route, who will not be seen by the palliative care team. So what they found was that, surprisingly, patients who went in a conservative route actually ended up surviving longer. The other group of patients obviously wouldn't get any palliative care involvement. They ended up dying in hospital rather than at home, and even had a shorter lifespan compared to the patients who went in the conservative group. So this was like a landmark study as far as renal care and palliative care was concerned in UK. So the other group of patient, the HIV or the AIDS group. Now, we all have heard of have seen how the AIDS has changed, or AIDS epidemic has changed over the years. So when it was first diagnosed earlier on, HIV infection was an inevitable and a speedy death sentence. And obviously the palliative care was only at the end of life for such patient. But it's right now become it's a changing epidemic. And but on top of that, even though it's a changing epidemic, there are no new needs for palliative care for such patients. And what we have seen is that patients who are started on HAART or the antiretroviral therapy will actually have a near normal life expectancy compared to the patients who doesn't have AIDS. So that is that's an advantage of such HAART for life-saving medications for AIDS. But what we have seen is that there is a lot of palliative care needs for such patients who are surviving on the HAART. So this is a graph in the previous presentations. It's a survival curve or the graph. So the curve on the top, or the thick line, the dark line, is a typical curve where you can see that they tend to have sort of like near normal life and gradually come down, gradually deteriorate, and then they reach a point when it becomes metastatic, and then they have a sudden dip, and then they come down, hospital admission, and they probably won't survive that admission, and they die. So when they reach end of life, or last stage of life, it's usually quite easy to detect if it's a cancer patient, because the signs and symptoms of end of life are usually very easy to identify, and they usually go down pretty quickly. Now, the pre-HAART AIDS was compared to this group of patients. Now, the other group of patients, the non-cancer patient, the congestive cardiac failure, the COPD patient, or the dementia patients, what they have shown is that they have a time when they have a gradual deterioration, and then there's a dip in the curve. When they have one hospital admission, they deteriorate. You think they're dying, but they don't die. They bounce back, they come back, but they don't come back to baseline. They deteriorate again. So there'll be lots of dip in their life, and finally they have an end of life and they die. Now, the AIDS patients in the HAART era are compared to this group, it's a chronic illness condition now, where they can go on for some time and have a near normal life expectancy. So how can we help? So how can we help in such patients? So what is the palliative care need for such patients? So there are lots of areas where on those patients where domains where our input is needed. First one is about the HIV infection as such. It's a chronic immune deficiency infection. So there can be inflammation, immune problems. So they can have recurrent infection because of that. Now these patients can have other psychosocial issues, because patients who have got an HIV diagnosis usually have other psychosocial problems also, like substance abuse, mental health problems. There'll be social isolation, stigma, and they also need the advanced care planning for any other chronic illness, like a chronic disease. They can have drug toxicities. So whatever medication they're taking, they can have some drug toxicities because of that, hepatic metabolic toxicities. They also can have some non-AIDS related comorbidities. So they can have cancer diagnosis. We all know AIDS-defining malignancies can come, cardiovascular problems, pulmonary problems, any other non-AIDS related comorbidities can be there. And the other one is because they are an aging population, because they're living longer. So age-related morbidity, the frailty, premature aging, polypharmacy, and issues at end of life can also happen. And then they can also have some environmental stressors like poverty and unsafe environment. So there's lots of physical, social, psychological needs for these patients, and there's lots of areas where palliative care can have a role. Moving on to dementia. Again, this was mentioned earlier on. The symptoms as commonly seen in advancing dementia. So remember George, our patient. So he can have confusion. So 83% is very, very common in dementia. George was doubly incontinent, so about 72% double incontinence. Pain, 64% of patient. They can be depressed, low mood, constipation, 59%, and loss of appetite. So again, all the symptoms that we typically deal with a cancer patient, patients with advanced dementia can have. So I've mentioned some of a scale here to assess the functioning. There's lots of scales available to actually denote. We all know that we do a mini mental state examination to diagnose dementia or for the cognitive assessment. But to assess the functioning, there are different scales available, like clinical dementia rating, FAST scale of functional assessment stage, and global deterioration scale or GDS. Here I have mentioned the FAST scale. Now it's a 7-stage system. It's based on the patient's level of functioning and its ability to perform the activities of daily living than on the cognitive decline. So it basically goes to the functioning of the patient. And usually it's used to denote about mild to moderate to severe stages of dementia, when we can no longer use an MMSE to reflect any meaningful changes. So you go with the functional ability of FAST scale. Now, early stages of the dementia, the patient may be able to participate in the FAST administration, but later on, what happens is that the information is usually collected from the caregiver or the nursing staff. Now it has got 7 stages, and if you go through the different stages, what you can see is that stage 1, there's no subjective or objective difficulties. What is normally is like a normal adult. So stage 1 you can say is normal adult. Stage 2 is a normal older adult. That means they complain of mild misplacing objects or a word finding difficulty. So that's a normal but older adult. Stage 3 is a very early dementia. Stage 4 becomes a mild dementia. Stage 5 is a moderate dementia, and stage 6 is a moderately severe dementia, and 6 has got A to E, and then stage 7 is a severe dementia. So, and all these are, it's a progressive condition. So we can, depending on what all the patient can do and what all the patient can't do, we can actually denote the stage of the dementia. Now, what are the indications? So what all things can we do? What are the interventions we can do in dementia patients? So again, think about George. What could we have done if he had got involved in his care? So there's advanced care planning. He had about 3 admissions in the last 1 year, or always probably ended in ICU and then getting better and going back home, but no quality of life at all when he goes back home, comes back again with another infection, under admission. Okay, avoidance of potentially burdensome treatment. So you can do an advanced care planning. You can actually have ideally we should have had advanced care planning in the early stage of dementia when George is able to participate in that. Now, if we miss that boat, we can still have advanced care planning with Susan, his wife. Ask about what he would have wanted. What is the best thing for him? You can avoid potentially burdensome treatments. You can also refer to hospice if that's available. So if wherever you're working, if there's a hospice available, a palliative care facility available, you can refer George for that. So when he gets some, so normally in UK, what we normally do is hospices, they vary with wherever region you're working. Some hospices are very, very basic. They just provide basic nursing care, but some hospices are quite advanced and we give IV antibiotics, IV fluids. Sometimes you also support with NIV because you get staff from the hospital coming to support us. So all those, and you can be looked after in an environment which is not like a hospital. So it's like it's a it's a much more friendly environment. It's a much more friendly environment than hospital, so patients and the carers can be looked after. So such patients need an environment like that, not an acute hospital environment. And also palliative care in dementia, you can also give caregiver support. Now, a few words or 1 or 2 slides about neurological disorders other than dementia. There's a group of disorders like amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or motor neuron disease, Parkinsonian syndromes, multiple sclerosis, ischemic hemorrhagic stroke. All these palliative care have a role at some point in their life, and there are some medications. Again, symptom management you would have learned, but I've mentioned a few medications which can be given, a few symptoms that happens in patients with neurodegenerative conditions, and the medications that you can give. So constipation is very common, so just use the whatever laxatives you have learned, osmotic and stimulant laxatives. Dyspnea, obviously opioids. If there's anxiety, you can give benzodiazepine. Fatigue, you can give a bit of SSRI or psychostimulant can be given. Muscle cramps, quinidine. Pain, depending on the severity and chronicity, you can try tramadol, tapentadol. I'll only mention the medication that's available in our country. You can also use morphine, but ideally, if it's a long-term non-cancer, then I wouldn't go for strong opioid, but you can use weak opioids. Or if it's for neuropathic pain, you can use the analgesic antidepressants like the tricyclics can be tried. If the patient has got some effects of pseudobulbar effect, like abnormal laughing, abnormally laughing, abnormally crying, mainly because of degenerative disorders, the patient is not able to control what happens. So it's something like an emotional dysregulation, like it's called emotional incontinence. So dextromethorphan, which is a cough suppressant, has been tried for that. You can also use quinidine for that. So these pseudobulbar effect is seen in some neurodegenerative conditions, and there's some evidence that you can try the cough suppressant dextromethorphan for that. Now, hypersalivation is very, very common. You can try amitriptyline or hyoscine hydrobromide or butybromide. Some patients, you can have psychosis agitation. So, non-pharmacological management, creating a calm and stable environment. Also try quetiapine and clozapine. Sleep disorders, you can try clonazepam and melatonin. Respiratory failure, this is mainly for the motor neuron disease or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Again, advanced care planning is very, very important, but if the patient prefers and if you think that's in the best interest, and if the patient goes to NIV, then tracheostomy route, care of tracheostomy patients, symptomatic treatment with morphine for breathlessness. And then symptoms related to rigidity of bradykinesia, amantadine, apomorphine, or midazolam can be given. So these are some of the medications you can try for the symptoms in neurodegenerative diseases. Continuing on, for insomnia, you can try sopicolone or zolpidem, amitriptyline, mirtazapine. For muscle spasticity, baclofen is very good. Physiotherapy, tisanidine. And for thick secretions, mucolytics and beta antagonist. And some supportive measures like nebulized saline can be used. A few words about frailty in old age. Now, this is a very, very common, especially our population is aging quite quickly now. So we are living, because the advance of the medical care, people are living longer now. So we're seeing more of a geriatric population. So by 2050, what's been projected is that about 16% of the world's population will be over 65. And that is about totaling 1.5 billion people as compared to 1950, which was only 5%. So there's a rise in the world's population, and this is seen in the most developed countries already, and that is one of the reason why there was some that's one of the reason that's mentioned, especially if you've been following the COVID news is the reason that there's a very high number of deaths from Italy was because most of the population in Italy is actually elderly. So they have a high cohort of elderly population, and unfortunately elderly population with comorbidities, if they get an illness like COVID, they end up dying. So that's why the death rate in Italy was thought to be quite high, mainly because of that. And this is a condition of most of the developed world now. And what is frailty? Frailty is defined as a diminishing capacity to withstand stress, and these patients will have increased vulnerability to adverse outcomes. So, and again, another point that I would like to mention is about related to COVID is that one of the NICE guidelines for there was a triage, and NICE used the guidelines to actually denote which patients should be for intensive care and which patients shouldn't be for intensive care or for best supported care. And one of the scores that they used was a clinical frailty score. And depending on the cutoff score of 4, they decide whether if it's more than 4, that means they're more frail, or then they shouldn't be for intensive care. So you can see that why it's like, because if you're more frail, there's increased vulnerability to adverse outcome. So a young patient having a COVID infection might just get better because the body will cope to it, but the elderly will not. They have a adverse outcome more commonly. There's a physical disability, and also this impairment of activities of daily living, the social withdrawal, slow motor processing, cognitive changes, weight loss, negative energy balance. So any elderly, your grandparents, if you can think of, there's a slowing there, generalized slowing, the social withdrawal, it's all indicating of frailty. Why is it important? Why should we detect that? So there's increased risk of falling. There'll obviously be increased hospitalization because the chance of infections are high. There's reduced activities of daily living. They'll be disabled, and death. 35% of deaths in older adults could be delayed if frailty was prevented. So people are now doing research on that and trying to prevent frailty. So that again, as a result of that, people will live longer. So what they say is that 35% of deaths in older adults can be delayed if frailty was prevented. So how do you prevent frailty? Primary prevention, I think that's been going on for some time, is about comorbid illness like hypertension. Secondary prevention of chronic disease management, exercise and nutrition. And tertiary prevention is good palliative care. Maintain and improve function, control of symptoms, maintain psychological well-being, and prevention of hospital administration. The important thing to remember is these patients actually will do better if they're managed at home than they're taken to hospital, because the chance of getting a secondary infection from hospital is quite high. So always the aim should be to prevent hospital admissions for such patients. Okay, I'll just touch base on psychiatric illness also, and that's also with relevance to oncology rather than going into details of depression. Major depression is very, very common in oncology or cancer patients. The studies shows that 38% of oncology patients or cancer patients have got major depression. And the prevalence of depression spectrum disorders also quite high. It's 58% compared with the general population. General population's 12-month prevalence is about 6.6% and 16.6% lifetime prevalence in a general population, general community for depression. But in oncology patient, the prevalence of depression spectrum disorders is very high, 58%. Now, that comes under a different diagnosis of depressive disorder due to other medical condition. So this can be conditions like hypothyroidism, chronic uremia, or cancer-induced cytokines, or medication effects of steroids, or chemotherapy agent. If patient is diagnosed with depression, then they don't go into the main diagnosis of depression. They go into DSM-5 criteria, where it says it's a depressive disorder due to another medical condition. Now, why is it important in cancer? It's mainly because there are some untreated depression will affect the treatment adherence. So treatment compliance can be affected. So patient has got reduced understanding of the illness, and because of that they don't make a right decision. So about the palliative treatments or even curative treatments, they're not able to choose the right treatment because their understanding is affected. There's decreased motivation for care and for healthy behaviors, and they also got pessimism about the outcome and the benefit, and they also have poor tolerance of side effects and poorer family support and greater isolation. So this is important. That's why it's important to identify the depression in this patient, because it affects their compliance to treatment, and thereby it affects their outcome. There are a few screening tools which we can use for depression. Again, I won't go into details. I'll just mention them. There are some Beck Depression Inventory, National Comprehensive NCNN, Distress Management Panel, actually recommends screening all the patients or cancer oncology patients using any of these tools for depression. So you can either use a BDI or Beck Depression Inventory, General Health Questionnaire, GHQ-28, Patient Health Questionnaire, or Distress Thermometer, or even a simple question like, are you depressed? Do you feel low in mood? If they say yes, then probably they'll need help with that. So, or they'll need further assessment. So that this is what the NCCN suggests, that all the oncology patients should be asked a screening question about their depression. Now, again, another one important thing that we all hear about is, or has heard of probably, is about physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia. What we have seen is that depression is one of the major causes of why patients ask for that. So you can see that once your spiritual well-being is affected, or you've got pain and other symptoms, this can accumulate together and can affect, and they can feel that their life is meaningless. They'll become depressed. They'll also have functional limitation because of the pain and other symptoms. All these, there will be lack of social support. All these will make them feel they're hopeless, and then they can ask for a desire for death. So this is what is usually found in patients who ask for euthanasia or patient-assisted, physician-assisted suicide. That's the reason for the suicidal ideation. So again, important thing to identify depression and treat it earlier on. What Dutch studies have shown that depressed patients are 4 times more likely to request euthanasia than the non-depressed patients. And again, in Netherlands, there was another study which found that 25% of patients in a palliative care program wanted to discuss euthanasia. So it's very, very common there. And the most important reasons why they're saying is that because one is a fear of process of dying, other one is a burnout or equivalent to demoralization. They feel worthless. Whatever happened in their life, it's adding together, they feel worthless. There's burnout, there's stress, there's a need for control, and depression is one of the important causes, and also a poor symptom management. So if you're able to address all these efficiently, usually the patient's desire to die actually comes down. Now, quickly going to the pharmacological treatment of depression, there are some suggested medications on one side and the other uses in palliative care. So I'm sure you would have had pain sessions and you know that amitriptyline can be used in neuropathic pain. So you've got a range of dose here, 25 to 150 milligram. Obviously, the lower dose is for neuropathic pain, higher dose is for depression. So that's tricyclic group. The second one is the SSRI group. We've got a variety of choice, citalopram, fluoxetine, sertraline, and the dosage is also given here. And in palliative care, we use that for not just for depression, we can use for anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorders, and PTSD. Then SSNRI, venlafaxine, is another good medication for severe depression and anxiety. The dosage is from 37.5 venlafaxine to 450 milligram. That's the maximum dose. Duloxetine also can be given. It's a newer one, 15 to 60 milligram dosage. Other medications are you can have you can have medications like bupropion, which is selective dopamine and noradrenaline reuptake inhibitors. Mirtazapine, again a newer one, noradrenergic and specific serotonin antidepressants like mirtazapine has got less side effects, and in palliative care we use for depression, anxiety, appetite to weight gain, and insomnia. Trazodone, I'm sure it's familiar one for sleep and depression, and also psychostimulants. Psychostimulants in palliative care, usually for depression, it's pretty quicker acting. It's got lots of side effects, so we don't go as a first line. But in patients who's got a very short prognosis, who don't have the time for the conventional antidepressants to start working, we suggest a low dose of methylphenidate or modafinil can be given. Also for opioid sedation, we can use psychostimulants. Okay, so now just the last few slides, I would like to discuss about why doesn't patients get referred to palliative care. So one of the important barrier that has been found is it's a prognostic uncertainty. So there was a support study was done for palliative care for heart failure, where the physicians tried to guess or try to make a suggestions about prognosis of patients, and what they found that in that study was, especially for heart failure, because they have got a chance of having the sudden death, 50% of the patients with heart failure who were predicted to have prognosis of more than 50% chance of survival for more than 6 months. So the prediction was that they would survive for more than 6 months, 50% chance of survival, but they found that these patients died 3 days later. So this came in the support study, and that's one of the reasons why physicians feel that they can't prognose it sufficiently. There's a prognostic uncertainty, so they can't decide when to start palliative care. So not knowing how long the patient will live, so you don't know whether they're the right time to refer to palliative care, so you feel powerless about doing that. Now the physician has got a natural desire to be optimistic, so they don't want to alarm the patient, because we all know that in our culture, when you see a palliative care physician, that then the patient and the family feels that the treating physician has given up. That's the last stage, so they don't want to alarm the patients about the unnecessarily with the thoughts of impending death. Then the feeling that it could be a failure. If I'm referring to palliative care, maybe it's because I failed, I'm not able to help the patient. Lack of skills of symptom control, probably it's also because hospital policy or lack of palliative care services. So these are some of the barriers that has been identified in why the physicians or why the patient don't get referred for palliative care services. From the patient and family point of view, again, the same thing. I don't have cancer, so why should I see a palliative care physician? Failure to recognize that it's a terminal illness. A non-cancer is also a terminal illness. Failure to recognize that. And sometimes the carers are unprepared to decide whether they are rightly transition from a life-sustaining to a aggressive comfort care. So they can't prepare, they can't decide in their mind whether it's the right time to go from the life-sustaining treatment to the comfort care. So how do we, how do we refer, or when do we refer to? Is it a good tool to help us to refer for palliative care? Now, this is an important and it's a very good tool. It's a SPIC tool. It's a tool for identifying the patient with advanced life-limiting condition who could benefit from a palliative care approach to their management, and then they can receive appropriate care that's appropriate to their needs, and they can also receive a coordinated care planning. So what they've in this indicator, what they've found is that they take 2 or more general indicators of deteriorating health and any clinical indicator of 1 or more advanced condition. So this tool has covered almost all the advanced condition which I've mentioned here. So it can be a general indicators of deteriorating health like performance status or unplanned hospital admissions, or they're dependent on others for their care needs. That's general indicators. And then specifically, if it's a cancer patient, then functional ability, performance status, dementia, there are some indicators in that, unable to dress, so you can use fast scale for that. Neurological diseases, again, progressive deterioration. So each of the conditions that I've mentioned here is in this tool, and you use a tick box, and you find that this patient, so if it's heart disease, NYHA class 3 or 4 heart failure, extensive untreatable coronary artery disease, breathlessness, or severe inoperable peripheral vascular disease. So these are some of the conditions mentioned. In liver disease, if it's advanced cirrhosis or with more complications in the past year, so you can have hepatic encephalopathy, hepatorenal syndrome, peritonitis. So this more in the last 1 year, how many times the patient had this, episodes of that, and patient is not a candidate for transplant. Advanced cirrhosis patient, kidney disease stage 4 or 5. CKD, EGFR less than 30, and I mentioned all the other features, when they can be referred to palliative care: stopping dialysis, kidney failure, advanced diabetes. So what we see from the SPIC tool is that access to palliative care should be based on the need rather than the diagnosis. So whichever patient, just like I mentioned, serious health related suffering, any patient, irrespective of the diagnosis, if they have got a need, if they've got a serious health related suffering, they should be referred to palliative care. And the strong recommendation that we often say is a surprise question. So will I be surprised if this patient is died in the next 12 months? So if I look at a patient who comes to my OPD and think that, will I be surprised if the patient died in the next 12 months? And if I'm not surprised, if the patient died in the next 12 months, or the other way to put it is, will I be surprised if the patient's alive after 12 months? And if I am surprised if he's alive after 12 months, so that means I think, looking at the patient, is unlikely to survive more than a year, then maybe at this point you should refer to palliative care. So that is one of the surprise question, which was a trigger point for advanced care planning. So to conclude, palliative care is needed for all the patients with serious health-related suffering, which includes cancer and non-cancer. And there is still a need for further research into the needs assessment tool for specific conditions, as well as evidence of benefits of palliative care involvement. So we should have more studies done to find out, what's the benefit of early involvement of palliative care. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sunita. That was a very elaborate presentation covering all aspects of non-cancer illness, starting from respiratory, cardiac, HIV, including the psychiatric issues. Thank you so much. We'll take up a few questions before the presentation.
There's a few chat ones. I think it's a couple of mention about George. So Dr. Punita Vadi has said, we don't know if George was involved in planning of care. That's true. That is not mentioned in the scenario. He had prolonged illness. Yeah. So, when I mentioned dementia, I mentioned that we could have done George's care differently. If the advanced care planning was done, you could have made planning about keeping him at home rather than having hospital admissions, because ultimately when we look back, you can see that last 1 year of his life majority was spent in the hospital with no quality of life, was just prolonging things, and he just never came back to baseline. So this is the same thing for all the non-cancer conditions also. So an honest conversation with the patient and the family to say that your chance of surviving this admission or your chance of having good quality of life is nil. So do you want to be kept comfortable at home with managing? You can give oral antibiotics if needed and manage symptoms at home, rather and probably spend some quality time with your family, because he died in the ventilator in ICU without seeing his family. So Susan was not able to see him. So how is she going to accept that situation? So all those things needs to come into our conversation.
I saw Dr. Annette raising hand. Yes, Dr. Annette. Just unmute yourself.
I get a lot of hemiplegics in my daily practice. I mean, here, daily practice in tribal area, and they are bedridden. There is no treatment can be done. So they are also kind of you can say palliative care, which is non-cancerous. Can you say something about this, about these cases, hemiplegics?
Yeah, so that is one of the common ones that I think in Indian scenario, we also, I work in a government hospital now. So hemiplegia is like we get a lot of patients referred to us. Now the difference between the in a scenario in India and in UK where I've worked is the primary health system with the GP and the district nurses are sort of more advanced there, and you've got a community physios, community physiotherapists, and the rehab facilities advanced there. So we don't tend to get under palliative care stroke patients, but in India we do tend to get, because we tend to overlap all the functions. So what we normally do is, obviously, we need to advise the patient, the family, about how to care for a bedridden patient. So about the skin care, managing the bed sores, how do you turn the patient, the feeding issue. So if they've got Ryle's tube, then how do you feed them properly? Again, even if the Ryle's tube is there, there's a risk of silent aspiration. So they can have an aspiration pneumonia. This must be warned to the family about the chance of getting aspiration pneumonia. And then what do you do at that scenario? Are you going to take him to hospital again, or are you going to keep him at home? So all this they can manage. If you can manage antibiotics at home, then you can do that. Catheterization. So all these things, they need advice on, and this can be the staff and the medical staff.
Any other question?
Ma'am, I have a question. We have a stroke patient who is having a Ryle's tube in situ. He has a lot of secretions. Can we use hyacinth patches for him?
Yeah, if hyacinth patches are available, you can use that. Which state are you from?
From Bangalore.
Oh, good. Okay. I don't think we have do you have hyacinth care last week? I was looking for hyacinth patches, so you got it there. Very good.
I have never used, and I was happy to hear that there is hyacinth patch.
So
alternative, ma'am.
Yeah, so you can use hyacinth patches. I have used them in UK, and it's quite convenient for them. In Kerala, what we've been using is either glycopyrrolate tablet. So glycopyrrolate tablet can be used. Amitriptyline can be used, and glycopyrrolate as an injections we can use. The other one is Buscopan, hyacinth butyl bromide. That is as an injection. So anything can be used.
Subcutaneously, no? Hyacinth.
Yeah. Hyacinth butyl bromide, Buscopan subcutaneously, or a tablet is not much effective as compared to subcut version. So if subcut is available, then go for that, or the patch is the best one if that's available.
Ma'am, by using these agents, the oral mucosa will be damaged, or what? I'm worried, like the oral.
It's a balance. You shouldn't dry it up too much. So sometimes if the secretions are the more troublesome one, you go for this one. If you think it's going to dry it up too much, then obviously stop it and then give it a break. So just that sort of thing you can do.
Okay.
There is a chance that you can dry its secretions too much. So in that case, then you'll have to stop it at that time.
Okay. Is there any way to assess? Because I work in a setup where ICU setup. Patients with multiple medications, like many of them will be on diuretic, cardiac medications, antihypertensives, diuretics, everything will dry the mouth out. Or in this neuro setup, stroke patients will be all drooling. Both end of the spectrum. So I see these people who have dry mouth end up in tooth decay and all very fast.
So oral care for dry mouth is very important. So dry mouth, again, whatever, there are some Orobalance gel and artificial saliva. None of them seems to have much evidence, but physicians keep on prescribing them. We have done a literature review about the available evidence of dry mouth, and the only thing that actually had good evidence was, boiled sweets and chewing gum and just using ice lollies. Pineapple, pineapple chunks seem to work. It increase salivation. So what we normally say is, we can prescribe an artificial saliva, but if they're affordable, they can buy it. But what I normally advise is using just ice cubes or, ice lollies to increase salivation in pineapple chunks. But good mouth care is very, very important. So make sure that if the tongue is coated, give a soft toothbrush to advise a nursing staff to do a good mouth care. Look for thrush, because thrush is an important cause of dry mouth. If there's thrush there, then manage that with antifungals, and give soft toothbrush and do good mouth care, and also that's very, very important. Otherwise you'll get tooth decay. That's true. But if it's heart failure, you can't stop the diuretics, so that is very, very difficult. So you'll have to
Most of the
manage the dry mouth.
patients in the ICU, once we start allowing them oral food, they'll tell, I don't feel any taste. I don't know what food you're giving.
Yeah.
We don't have will dryness of mouth affect their taste sensation?
People do. It could be because of coated tongue, or thrush can definitely affect taste sensation. So people say it I don't know, it tastes horrible, like mud and all. I've heard
They
people
won't
say
even tell about their angina. They'll tell about this first.
yeah. It must be elderly people also, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because the priorities are different. Constipation is a major issue for them, but not for cardiologists. For elderly people, that is more important than their heart problem. So yeah, it's true.
Okay. Thanks.
Dr. Sunita, just related to that, another question. Have you ever felt when you, not for all the illness, but many times when you stop the artificial feeding and give the small feeds orally, do you think that the secretions comes down a lot? Have you ever felt that difference?
So you mean,
suppose a patient on NG2,
yeah,
when he starts taking a little bit of oral feeds, then we try to remove that tube as much as possible in our setting, right? So
yeah.
most often we have seen that the amount of secretions literally comes down.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think I've
I don't know what,
actually seen that. Is that an anecdotal thing? Yeah.
Yeah, that is one thing which I felt that I think they take only what is possible by them. So
The other one we are overloading, isn't it? Okay, that is quite a good point, actually. The other one we are just giving it, when patients start eating by themselves, and obviously I think that is quite it's an important point, because the amount of intake that take, excessive intake can come as secretions. So when the patients start feeding by themselves, obviously the intake comes down. So that could be the reason. But yeah, good point, Sridevi. Any other question or comments?
maybe just one last question before moving on to presentation. It has become mandatory that all the schools are online now, so they know how it works.
The doctor coming for her class now. I know.
Doctor, I think we can move on to case presentation now.
Raju, you're doing it from your side or Dr. Sunita is doing it from?
Our side. 1 second. Dr. Punita, you can start her.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy and excited to present this case today. It was a very nice presentation by Dr. Sunita. And I will introduce myself. My name is Dr. Punita. I work as an anesthetist in a medical college in Bangalore here. So I have taken a case, I have presented a case which I had done a year ago. I had been the anesthetist for her operations in a different hospital. Now she has come back with the complaints of severe pain. So I start the presentation now. She's Mrs. Mahalakshmi. She's a 75-year-old female. She's 7 kids of diabetes for the past 20 to 30 years, and she had a failed hemiarthroplasty to her right hip joint, and she now presents with left hip pain, severe left pain for more than 2 weeks now. About her pain, the pain is present in the left hip. The operated one was right hip. Now the pain is in the left hip and the thigh. It extends from her back and below until her knee joint. The knee joint is even swollen, and it is not red, but it is swollen. It is sometimes warm to touch, and the swelling in her hip and the lower back is swollen and painful, tender to touch. She also has swelling. All the swelling and all these things started a month ago. It slowly increased. The nature of the pain is sharp, squeezing. Sometimes it is sharp when she attempts to move, and most of the times it is squeezing. She tells that the pain is present constantly, even at rest. The score of which is, she gives a score of 5 to 7 at rest. The pain worsens to a score of 7 to 8 when she tries to sit on her bed. While she's moved to the commode, she has a bedside commode, or sometimes when she feels good, she will walk to the toilet in the same room, but still with the help of a walker. The score is like 10, she will end up crying or screaming. The patient also complains of intermittent internal feverishness and malaise of late for more than 2 weeks. She has visited her orthopedician who performed the surgery, hip surgery, and she was started on some pain medications which gave her temporary relief. I have attached the prescription in the slides. But after stopping the pain, yeah, ma'am.
Your voice is badly breaking. Are you closer to your router or something?
Yeah, I'm closer to my router.
Okay, ma'am, you can continue. I will tell you if your sound is breaking again.
Okay. Now, are you able to hear now?
Yes.
Okay, so she has stopped the pain pills, but she is continuing the other rest of her routine medications. But for the 10 days, what looked like it was okay, but it was not like she was very comfortable. Not very comfortable. The next slide. She uses a walker.
So, ma'am, are you using a headset?
No, I'm not using a headset. I'm using the computer audio.
Now it is clear, but in between it's breaking badly.
Okay, maybe I moved my laptop a little bit now. Okay, so I hope you're hearing me. She is being mobilized until a week or so. She was very well mobilized. She doesn't prefer to get lunch. She's been brought to the dining table with the help of a wheelchair or the walker and 2 people supporting. The breakfast and dinner are provided at bedside. A few months ago, she was walking around with the elevated shoe for right leg because she had shortness of the limb on the right hand side. So she had an elevated shoe and she was walking with the help of a walker all by herself. After that, feels stability and bends on its own. She also complains that her sleep is affected by the constant pain.
Dr. Puri.
Yeah. Are you able to hear me?
In between, yes, but when you start speaking, it is breaking in between.
Okay. Actually, I'm sitting very near to the router. It is on the same table actually.
Okay,
When-
you can
When
continue.
you are not reading the presentation, it's very clear. When you start reading the presentation, it starts breaking.
Okay, I'll try not to move my head, ma'am. Okay, next slide, can I have? Okay, coming to the past history, she is a known patient of rheumatoid arthritis for more than 25-30 years now. She has been taking methotrexate some kidney function issues. They have changed over from methotrexate to leflunomide, which is again immunosuppressant drug. She was initially put on 20 mg of leflunomide, but currently she is taking 10 mg and hydroxychloroquine 200 milligram OD. For the last 8 years, she is taking this disease-modifying agent 8 years now. Whenever she gets in that case, she the symptoms regular
Doctor, we can't hear you.
Okay.
Whenever you speak, we can hear. Once the presentation is on, it is not.
Okay.
So can you repeat what you said?
Okay, I can repeat. So she is a rheumatoid arthritis patient for almost 20 years now. She was on methotrexate and hydroxychloroquine. She was on 20 milligram leflunomide for 5 years or so, and then the dose has been tapered to 10 mg OD. She is still on hydroxychloroquine 200 milligrams OD, and she is having this prescription almost for 8 years. She is taking on once in a year. She gets small joint swelling and feverishness. Then she takes this course, and once she feels all right, she stops steroids. Last year, she had a fracture of her femur, on her right femur, and she underwent a hemiarthroplasty. Post surgery, she had a wound infection. She was found she was immunocompromised. She was on long term all these medications. She had a surgical infection, so her implant was removed, and she had a resurgery. So it was like a failed hemiarthroplasty. But post-operatively, she underwent a good, rigorous rehabilitation program, and she was mobile with a walker. Somebody has to help her to get up from her bed, but after that, she would walk by herself with the help of a walker. Her mobility is restricted to home since 1 year. Can I have the next slide? About family history, she is 74-year-old. She lives with her husband. He is 75 years. He is also diabetic. He had coronary artery disease. After an MI, he had a stenting, and he is managing by himself. He is very confident and active. He is very concerned about wife's health. They are an affluent couple. They have very good understanding. They talk to each other about they're very what to tell, like they discuss about their health and pain and all those things very well. They have 2 children, a daughter and a son. Both are settled with their families in the USA. The couple also lived in USA for some time, and they returned back some 5 years back or something. The daughter almost speaks every day to the mom to console her and to share her feelings about the current situation. The son was planning to come to India, but because of this COVID situation, he couldn't reach here. Next slide. psychosocial-spiritual history. She has had a very satisfactory life with, in spite of her rheumatoid arthritis. She feels very good about how she had spent her lifetime with her husband and children, and the care which is being provided by her family to her. She has a full-time home nurse to help her, and she also has a visiting physiotherapist who comes sometimes every day or sometimes every alternative days. But currently, because of this COVID situation, there was a break in the care. The only thing which she feels bad about is dependency on the people for even sitting on her bed or moving out of her bed. She does not like to use a bedpan. She doesn't like to be a bedridden patient. She wants to be mobile. She is a very orthodox person. She chants to get some relief. She has strong religious beliefs. She watches some Venkateshwara TV channel for 2-3 hours per day in the morning to distract herself from the pain. Sometimes if you talk to her, she'll talk about her family and grandchildren just to distract her pain. She is not of that complaining nature. She doesn't complain too much about her pains, unless otherwise you ask her. Or when you move her, she just to cope up the pain, intolerant pain, she will wail loudly, or she'll moan silently, or shed tears when the pain becomes intolerable. But that is what has become a big concern for the husband. He's feeling, I'm not able to give good care to the wife. His husband is well educated. They're willing to spend any amount of money for her well-being and pain relief, but he feels helpless now. Next slide. So that's about the history. Coming to general examination, her BP is 110/70. Her pulse rate is 70. She is afebrile, though she was complaining of some feverishness. So she's afebrile. She is a very thin patient. Body weight is 40 kg. She looks skin and bones. She has almost every gadget at her home, a BP apparatus, a pulse oximeter, an oxygen concentrator, everything. So they monitor vitals regularly. She is pale and she has some presacral edema. She has a claw foot and claw hands. Her small joints are all deformed. She cannot write using a pen. She cannot hold a pen, she can hold a spoon and eat with in between the two fingers. If somebody keeps a spoon, she can eat by herself, but she cannot hold things so easily. Her spine is normal, has some minimal kyphosis. Otherwise, there are no other major deformities. Coming to the left hip, which is now the primary organ of concern. The left hip is painful, swollen. The back is also swollen, a little bit, not much. The knee joint is swollen and it is tender. Next slide, please. About the other systems, as I told earlier, there is renal compromise due to her long-term rheumatoid arthritis medications. But it is very well managed. Almost for 8 to 10 years now, she has maintained a creatinine level of 1 to 1.5. It's never gone worsened because she was changed to leflunomide. For leflunomide, they are monitoring her liver enzymes. It's been very regularly monitored. And coming to cardiac system, she has a compromised LV function of 40% EF, but she is asymptomatic because she's restricted to bed and to the room. She doesn't walk much. The respiratory efforts are also compromised, but she's asymptomatic. But she gives history of on and off wheezing, and she uses Livolin and Budicort nebulizations at home by herself. She has an oxygen concentrator. She puts a pulse oximeter on her hand, sees if it goes down. She'll ask for a nebulizer. The rheumatology doctor has suggested this because leflunomide can cause some pulmotoxicity. Her bowel and bladder habits are very normal. She has no complaints about that. And she has no issues in her diet intake. Next slide, please. Coming to her lab investigations, these are all recently done. Her hemoglobin is 9.3. Her white cell count, total count, and differential count are normal. Her platelets are normal. Her creat is now a little bit gone up to 1.6 after that course of NSAIDs what she took recently with the last month's prescription. Her sugar is normal. Her liver enzymes are good. CRP has not been done. Her X-rays and X-rays of hip and knee I have attached in the next slide. Ultrasonogram of knee I thought might help, but it's not being done because of the current situation. Next slide, please. This is her X-ray. The left-hand side one is the X-ray which was taken last year after her surgery, after her fracture neck of femur. The right-hand side X-ray is actually it's on the right. It's wrongly means it's a mirror image actually. The right head of femur is absent. If you can see, the joint of concern now is a left hip. The joint space is like very minimal, and we can see some cystic lesions in the hip joint. Yeah. Next slide, please. Coming to her medications, apart from the leflunomide 10 milligram OD and hydroxychloroquine 200 milligram OD, which she is taking for the last 8 years, this is the prescription last month what she took. The third column I'm reading out, aceclofenac 200 mg and with rabiprazole combination of 20 mg NSAID was given for 10 days, which she took. It gave her some relief. She was given a muscle relaxant Myoril which contains thiocolchicoside. That was also given for 10 days. She felt some relief definitely, but after stopping that, she feels all her pain has come back. And she was worried about the kidney condition. In fact, she stopped it even before 10 days. She took, she was also prescribed methylcobalamin and pregabalin and nortriptyline combination for the neuropathic component. She was complaining of some sharp shooting pain, so this was also added. The next 2 drugs was not on her prescription, but she takes it by herself. Tidol 50 milligram tablet. Once in a while in the night, she will take like weekly once or twice. Sometimes she takes Ultracet Semi, but she doesn't take the both together. She is educated. She tells I don't take both together, but weekly once or twice I'll take Tidol and once or twice Ultracet Semi. And other than that, she takes lots of OTC medications, supplements, because her children are in USA. They'll keep suggesting something. They'll order something in Amazon, magnesium spray, topical analgesics, some stickers, some patches, which she doesn't know the name details and all. Many things she won't know the name also, but she'll try everything you give. And hot and cold pack fomentations she takes regularly. She ties a compression band to her knee. She tries all that on and off. So currently she has no adequate pain relief with all these medications, and the orthopedician has referred to a pain specialist, and they were suggesting for a interventional procedure or something if something can be done, and a rheumatology consultation was also taken for her. So next slide, please. So coming to the, my presentation is over. Coming to the discussion points, I thought if we could discuss in the aspect of like the diagnostic aspects, is it rheumatoid flare which is causing the pain, or she had osteoarthritis? Does the management differ at this stage of life, or how are we going to treat? And is there any further evaluation, if any one of you feel any further evaluation will help her to help us to handle the situation better? And in detail, drug optimization aspects, I definitely felt the drugs, the analgesics are not well optimized, because step 2 opioid is taken SOS basis. It's not being given regularly. So we might have to put it regularly. So the questions what all I got in my mind was, is there a role of steroids for her if it is a rheumatoid flare-up? Is there a harm in giving? But sometimes the orthopedician is not in favor of giving her Visalone because already she had a surgical site infection, and he's not in favor of starting a steroid course, especially a prolonged one. And she's a weak and frail patient, 40 kg patient. What about restarting hydroxychloroquine or any disease modifying agent? No, this slide was prepared before we got the rheumatology consult, but currently the rheumatology consult is over, and she has been advised to continue with only chloroquine, and the doctor has asked her to stop leflunomide. They had their consult today and it has been stopped. I also I wonder whether there's a role of Mucomix or N-acetylcysteine tablets as a form of renal protection, because inevitably over the counter sometimes she takes NSAIDs by herself. Then other things are like, as I told earlier, step 2 and 3 opioids, how about putting it on regular basis, like putting around Ultracet, a full dose of Ultracet or Tidal regularly, and how can we put it? And the other things are like role of lignocaine patches. Is there any role in lignocaine patch for her current situation? And can we use a fentanyl patch for her when she's at home? And the next one is what the orthopedician was suggesting, like, is there a role of interventional neuroablative procedures or epidural opioids or interventional spinal procedures for her, but she's too weak to undergo any aggressive interventional procedure. The patients, we have already also got an interventional pain specialist advice. He was suggesting a genicular nerve branch block, which can be given ultrasound guided for the knee joint and fluoroscopy guided for the hip joint. He tells the knee joint injection is a very simple one, not an aggressive one. For the hip joint, it needs a fluoroscopy and a proper hospital admission and a setup, OT setup. The other option was like a joint lavage of the knee joint or the hip joint, which washes out all the inflammatory things. Synovitis will come down, and we can inject some intra-articular steroid to help her symptoms to come down as an anti-inflammatory. And is there a role of alternative therapies like acupuncture or TENS for patient who has inflammatory pain? Like a problem, family support is not a problem. The whole family is willing to support her. They have enough adequate resources, but still there is a lot of fear in the patient. Sometimes she would speak to us about her pain and how the day is going to be. What are the expectations? She's not able to clearly tell us, and I sometimes really don't know how much reassurance to give her, how to have the conversation about that to her. And also support for her husband, as he is also an elderly patient, a diabetic and CAD. He is working more because children are abroad. He is doing beyond his limits to take care of her. So these many things I thought of discussion. If time permits, we can discuss on these things. Thank you for the wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Punita. It's just that we are reaching the time limit. I would like to directly go to Dr. Sunita, because Dr. Punita is actually waiting for a lot of answers. The moment we asked about come up with a presentation, so she really needs this to go back and improve all this. So, and all others can type in the chat session. We'll read it out. So, please, over to Dr. Sunita.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Prinda. That's actually a very good case, like complex pain management. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to cover the whole questions that you've asked. But I think the first thing is, in this case, is for us to know what is the diagnosis, what's the cause of the current pain, isn't it?
Yes.
So she had this hemiarthroplasty 1 year back, which has failed.
Yes, ma'am.
So that means, so how is the joint? That means they have removed the hip, because the second X-ray doesn't have it, right? So
Yes.
what's it?
The head is removed. There is no stability of the right hip joint. That's why she is
Okay.
not supposed to put pressure on her, too much of pressure on her right hip. She can,
Okay.
but more than 50% of her weight load should not be put on her right hip.
Okay. So then, since then, how was the pain? Was it very bad?
No,
The arthritic pain.
the arthritic pain of the right hip has been like better, much better after the surgery and all, because the joint is being distorted already, means they have removed the femoral head. So she doesn't have currently no pain on the right hip. Slowly.
No pain, but it's unstable. That's all. Okay, fine.
The
So
joint-
something acute has happened quite recently, isn't it? That's why there's a flare up.
She has
So
to
it
put
could
all
be
the
either.
weight on left hip now, ma'am.
Okay, so the pain is in the left hip now.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, because she's putting more weight on left hip. So the pain could be, and the left hip doesn't have any new fracture or anything, isn't it?
New fracture, they were not sure of until they took the X-ray, but now they have ruled out the fracture.
Okay.
That's no.
So this redness that you're saying, is it because of rheumatoid, or is it because any other arthritis, or?
Ma'am, it is because of the rheumatoid. Now I spoke to the orthopedician. He feels it's completely rheumatoid only.
Okay, fine. So if you go back to the other slide, if you give me the slide with the medication list on.
She is on 4. Currently, she is not on any analgesics other than this SOS, Tidol, and Ultracet. This.
And why is she on Ultracet semi? Why can't we give a full dose Ultracet?
She was long time back. She was prescribed that, and she's still sticking to that.
Okay, fine. And that's also SOS. So I think probably she has an element of nociceptive pain predominantly, and a bit of neuropathic pain because it's a chronic pain. So there is a role for neuropathic agents. But what we're giving her, we probably can titrate it up and give a correct right dose. If I was treating this patient, I would either go for proper Ultracet and give it for 3 times a day. So it shouldn't be SOS, it has to be regularly, or just switch it over to Tapentadol itself rather than giving them both together. Because both Tramadol and Tapentadol are weak opioids, step 2. So there is no point in giving both of them. You can just titrate and make it tidy with one.
Between the two, which would you go for, ma'am?
I would go for Tapentadol because it has got, if she can afford it, obviously because it's expensive, because it's got fewer side effects. So, like vomiting and nausea is not there. It's a cleaner one. So give it regularly 4 times a day, 50 to 100 maximum. We can give 100 4 times a day. 400 is the maximum dose. So that is the opioid taken care of. Now you asked, so I probably will be answering a few questions. You mentioned about fentanyl patch.
Yeah.
Now, fentanyl is a strong opioid. So normally, when we go for a strong opioid, have you got buprenorphine patch there?
Yeah, we have got. Yeah.
Okay. So buprenorphine at lower dose, we consider to be a weak opioid. At higher doses,
license to prescribe that, or it's I can just prescribe any doctor.
Buprenorphine, actually, you can just prescribe. It can be kept any pharmacy. Fentanyl is the one that needs a hospital license.
Okay.
The hospital has got the IV morphine license, and hospital has a fentanyl license. It's not available to where I'm working now, but it was available to private hospital Amrita because they had a separate license.
Okay.
It's a stronger opioid. It needs that triplicate form and all. Buprenorphine, anybody can prescribe.
Okay.
And buprenorphine is a 7-day patch. So how we normally convert is usually, buprenorphine starts at 5 microgram per hour strength, 10 microgram, 15 and 20. These are the weaker options available. And 5 microgram is normally equivalent to about 10 milligram of oral morphine.
Okay.
Now this, if you are giving her Tapentadol 50 milligram 4 times a day, or Tramadol 54 times a day, that will be the maximum dose is about, so it's 200 milligram is actually equivalent to 20 milligram of oral morphine. So divided by 10. So if she's tolerating a dose of a weak opioid regularly round the clock, and the pain is still not getting controlled, or you want a stronger option, you can either convert it to buprenorphine. This is the first line. No
Okay.
harm in giving fentanyl, but I would go for, because she's not taking any regular opioid at all. She's just taking SOS, right?
Yeah.
So see how the pain is with the regular one. So that is the opioid one. Okay. Then the other one is a neuropathic agent, where again you're giving a combination of pregabalin and nortriptyline.
Yeah.
Again, that is what most of the people in India, we do like that. The only
Okay.
problem with this neuropathic agents also, we need to titrate up. So normally what I would do is I start with the single agent first.
Okay.
Either if the sleep is an issue or depression is an issue, you go for an antidepressant first. So start
Okay.
amitriptyline or nortriptyline as one of those, and then after 3 days increase it up. So amitriptyline 10 at night, increase it 25, and see how that works. Once you're on a maximum tolerable dose of that and still the pain is not getting better, you add in an anticonvulsant to it. So you can add pregabalin to it, but as a separate one. Then start as HS and make it BD and titrate up.
Okay.
So these things you can do. Then the question about that aceclofenac and rabeprazole, I wouldn't give it because of this renal failure history. I would strongly discourage her to not take that. And I've never even thought of doing this NSL mucocystine to protect the kidney and give aceclofenac to that. I've never done that, so I'm not confident to comment on that.
Okay.
I would rather that she doesn't take the NSAID if possible.
But do you use N-acetylcysteine in palliative care anytime?
No, I've seen renal people use when I was in Amada, but I haven't used in for renal protection in palliative care. We have never used that. Even in UK also, that's not a practice. But renal people, I've seen, or maybe physicians I've seen prescribing, they say it's protecting for kidneys.
Okay.
But I haven't actually read up on the evidence of that, so I'm not sure. I don't use that in palliative care.
Okay.
And coming back to the other questions, shall we come back to the other slide now? Again, muscle relaxant, if you think that's beneficial, you can continue that.
Muscle relaxant, how long can we continue?
This one, again, if there's any side effects, as in, is it
Yeah, I'll go through the
yeah, like if it's affects the kidneys or affects the liver, then probably I wouldn't continue long term. If you definitely have, there can be a spasm, because spasm is like a protective mechanism of how the body reacts to pain. So there will be an amount of spasm. So probably there's a role in that. But if you actually control the nociceptive pain well enough, you might not even need a muscle relaxant.
Okay.
It's actually the body is reacting to the pain, the nociceptive pain, by protectively. One is like vasoconstriction, spasms, all protective mechanism. That's why she said needing a muscle relaxant. Then again, looking at it, other like your ejection fraction is 40%, her pulmonary compromise is there. So I think probably prognosis wise she doesn't have a long term. So maybe so it's justified in giving her fentanyl patches also, like a long opioid also, because I don't think she's got a great prognosis anyway. Otherwise, I wouldn't normally give a strong opioid for a non-cancer pain.
And buprenorphine and tapentadol can be given together?
So no, what I would do is, so again, patches are you need to have a stable pain to convert to patch. So patches start some time to start working. So normally buprenorphine at least take 48 hours to start working, and then it's a 7-day patch. So it goes to a peak, and then by 7 day you have to take off the patch and put a new patch on. Otherwise the pain will get worse. So the drug wears off. So normally what we normally advise is if you are stable on a tapentadol dose, continue with that, and then you put a patch on, continue the tapentadol for like 2 to 3 days, and stop the tapentadol and see whether that's enough. Buprenorphine is enough. So if not, you can give it SOS.
Okay.
So ideally, morphine because it's short-acting one, but because the renal functions are not that great, but it's not that bad. You can still give morphine for her, but there is a chance that it can accumulate. So fentanyl is the safest one. Fentanyl and buprenorphine both are safe in renal failure.
Okay.
But patch, always be careful with the titrating bit, because it takes some time to start working. And once you have a stable dose of patch, then you can continue the same dose. But if the pain is not getting better on a 5 patch, so with this, maybe you have to start with the starting dose of, if you're taking the starting dose of normal morphine, which you have learned in the morphine classes, which is 30 milligram, right? 5 milligram 6 times a day is 30. The even dose of buprenorphine patch is actually 15 microgram patch. So you have to put a 10 patch and a 5 patch on. That is the starting equivalent dose. Equivalent dose of fentanyl will be 12.5 microgram patch. So that's the smallest patch. You put, and fentanyl is a 3-day patch. So you change every 72 hours. So it's much more quicker acting. Within 12 hours, it starts working. Every 3rd day, you change the patch. So ideally, if the patient's on morphine, then you continue the morphine for like 1 day on, continue the short-acting morphine, then stop the morphine and continue the patch and see, but give it SOS because we don't know whether the pain control is adequate or not. Always give it SOS, if you're on a patch, and then depending on that, you can increase it.
Okay.
Again, blocks will have a role because the nerve supply to the joint will be there. So it's better if she's got problems with medications. If you can afford intervention, I would suggest that if somebody can give a nerve block, maybe that is the best thing. I can't comment about the triamcinolone one because I haven't done that and I'm not sure whether that will work. Acupuncture also seems to have a role in lots of chronic pain. So if your facility has got, if your hospital has got a service for acupuncture, a good acupuncturist probably might be able to help.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, anything else? Sridevi, you want to add something?
Yeah, joint lavage has a very weak evidence on this arthritis related whatever it is. It has a very bad this thing. It's not very useful in any kind of arthritis. And triamcinolone can be done, but the result will be there only for a month or two. And there is a limitation in extending that repeating that procedure again and again after it's a steroid. So generally they don't do it more than 2 to 3 times. And again, thiocolchicoside, I think that is a drug that should be usually they don't give it for a long term. They taper it and stop like a steroid. I don't remember what exactly the reason was for tapering and stopping, but usually they don't give for long-term muscle relaxing. Flupiritin, I have used a very quite a lot when I was in Manipal, and it worked well for muscle relaxation. Muscle spasm related pain, but it is really important, as Dr. Sunita mentioned, it is important to avoid the nociceptive pain because this muscle spasm is a reactive mechanism to the nociceptive pain. So it's reducing the nociceptive pain would be the first line of thinking in this patient.
Okay.
Flupiritin is actually a non-opioid, non-paracetamol, medication that's I think given for it's like a paracetamol, but it's better, and it has also got liver toxicity. So again, that is also not a long-term advised. I've seen lots of chronic pain doctors prescribe both of this. Like there's an intervention consultant who used to come to Amrit, and he's quite keen to prescribe this flupiritin and the thio one also. And he's given this, but they always give for a short time. After the procedure, they give for 5 or 10 days and then they stop it. So all these have been prescribed.
Okay.
Again, lignocaine patches, it's specifically lignocaine patches was initially and it's only licensed for post-herpetic neuralgia. Like it's for neuropathic pain. So, post-herpetic neuralgia, post-herpes zoster, you get that pain in that band. So it's specifically licensed only for that. But now, even in palliative care, we just use it right, left, for everything. Some people have, especially in UK, because it's quite commonly available, I've seen sometimes people put like 3, that's the maximum patch you can put is 3 lignocaine patches. People put in patches everywhere and they think it works. I think it's a placebo effect. It has some sort of cold sensation, so maybe that's why it's working. Ideally, it's for a neuropathic pain, and then you've got an area of neuropathic, that you can cover with a patch. That's the best way to place lignocaine patch. Ideally, evidence-based.
Okay. But she has multiple places, so it won't.
Yeah, so probably you can ask her for the maximum. It's all expensive, so it all depends on whether you lignocaine is also available in Bangalore. Oh my God, Sridevi. We need to
donated patches from people when they come from UK, and they give leftover patches, and we use it like some precious jewel.
Get at least that also. I don't get anything in GH. Very good. Okay.
Ma'am, for the purpose of breaking the vicious cycle, is there any role of ketamine?
Yeah,
or subcute or intranasal. I see so many papers like on intranasal ketamine.
Did you have the class on difficult pain? Ketamine has a role, but normally when we the guideline when we say ketamine is they should be on all that first line ones maximum. Then only you go for ketamine.
Okay.
So so I wouldn't go first line for that. Try all the simple ones, and if the pain is not working, then go for ketamine.
And I see there is no central sensitization as such. She's not complaining of head to toe pain. She still can recognize where exactly the pain is. So it is not yet gone into that stage where there is a central sensitization. That is a time where we can use ketamine. So I don't think she's a candidate.
Okay. Got it.
sorry we overshoot the time today, but the discussion was really important and interesting, so I didn't want to stop in between.
Yeah.
So I'll type the points whatever Dr. Sunita mentioned, and
Yeah.
thank you so much for your inputs, Dr. Sunita, and sorry for to all the other participants because I didn't ask them about their opinion because we didn't have time. And thank you, Dr. Punita, for your presentation, and it was good because we all could learn. So I'll type the points and send it as well.
Yeah, sure, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Both of you, Dr. Sunita and Dr. Devi, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. So we are launching the polls now. Please do give the feedback, then only leave the meeting. So a screen will
Thank
be
you.
there in
Sorry.
front. Please do it.
Thank you, Dr. Sunita, once again for taking the time out and join us. Thank you so much.
The presentation was very nice, ma'am. Your slides were very informative.
Thank you.
I could relate to myself when you were talking about the barriers in initiating palliative care, especially with prognostic uncertainty in cardiac. Every day I face it. So it was
That's the same dilemma we also face as palliative clinicians, because sometimes we know the patient so well, especially in UK, and they get referred quite early, and then they come to hospice, and then we have to decide whether it's actually end of life care or are they going to bounce back again, and we can't for
Yeah.
non-cancer patients. So it is a dilemma to decide. But it's always an honest conversation with the family.
Okay.
Just tell them, I'm happy to be surprised. I'll be surprised if we bounce back, but I'll be happy to be surprised if the patient comes back. And some people have done that. And that's
Okay.
fine. At least they're prepared.
So, ma'am, I'm planning to sketch 4 times daily.
Dr. Punita, we couldn't understand it. It was breaking badly. Can you repeat it once again?
So after the discussion, what I feel like is I should start her on tapentadol 4 times daily. She is just 40 kilos. So I will start with 50 mg 4 times daily, and then maybe 4 to 5 days of the muscle relaxant, what she was taking before the colchicide for 4 days. And I'll continue the pregabalin not-triplen combination as such. I wouldn't change it. And after 4-5 days of pain relief, I would overlap it with the buprenorphine patch of means she's 40 kg. I think as you told, 10 mg and 5 mg patch.
Yes, see how the pain is with tapentadol. If the pain is controlled with 50 tapentadol and she can take 4 times a day, then maybe just leave it like that. Otherwise, we can change to because the thing with the weak opioids is you can't increase it. There's a ceiling dose, isn't it? So you can give 100 milligram 4 times a day as a maximum. Because her body weight is low, maybe just go for the 50. Don't increase it to 100. But after that, then if the pain is still there, then there's no option of increasing tapentadol. So at that point, maybe switch her to the patch, and then gradually increase the patch up.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah. And again, for adult patients, normally you don't go with the body weight, but I think 40 is such a. So I'm worried more about the flupiritin because it can cause liver damage. Like paracetamol can cause liver damage quite easily if your weight is very low. So don't give. I don't think I would give a long-term flupiritin for her.
Okay.
So
Okay, maybe less than 5 days, 3-4 days.
very short time should be enough. When the acute phase is over, maybe stop it.
So the overlap of tapentadol and buprenorphine for 3 days is enough, ma'am?
Yeah, 48 hours. Again, it usually stabilizes in 48 hours. It's a rough estimate. So ask them to take SOS if needed. So give it for 2 days, patch and the buprenorphine together, and then stop the tapentadol. See how and maybe start with 10 microgram of buprenorphine patch. Because tapentadol,
Tapentadol or buprenorphine, should we give a MSET or any nausea, vomiting or
tapentadol, no need. Buprenorphine, some patients, it's lesser than tramadol, but few patients have reported nausea, vomiting. But constipation is a major issue for tapentadol. Patches, again, other advantages, constipation is less compared to morphine. Some might still have, but it's very, very less. So if they have, then just give it, that's all.
That was so clear, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll update how my patient is doing.
Oh, well, that'll be great.
Yeah. Sure, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, bye. Shall I just leave then?
Yeah.
Rashmi?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Bye.
See you later. Bye.